There we go. Just a second for everybody on YouTube. I had to hit the go live button. There we go. It is just me this morning, so I don't have my Caleb, my assistant, in the back running things. So it might be a little more technically clumsy, shall we say, as I'm trying to operate the screen and myself. But anyways, welcome back. This is, people have asked how many more I'm going to do. This is I got maybe this one and one or two more. That's about it. But I do want to go over all the different parts where he does talk about religionless Christianity in his letters. And what we'll find starting today is that he starts to formulate a theology. We start to finally get something that looks like a conclusion, not just an endless critique of what are we doing wrong, what are we missing, how are we not understanding the secular modern scientific world. But now we're going to begin to move into what would a theology look like? What is the importance? Where does Christ fit into all this? So this is going to be some fun stuff. So welcome aboard. With that then, we will just get started. I'll get situated here. And there we go. Gotta have my morning coffee. Can't survive without it. So, okay. Again, we are looking at the letters and papers from prison. This is a book. There's a couple different copies. I've been working on the 1997 copy. And so here we go. All right. Well, we'll just jump right in. We'll read through this. So here goes. God as a working hypothesis in morals, politics, or science has been surmounted and abolished. And the same has happened in philosophy and religion, Feuerbach. For the sake of intellectual honesty, that working hypothesis should be dropped, or as far as possible, eliminated. A scientist or physician who sets out to edify is a hybrid. Okay. Working hypothesis, that's our word of the day, kids. Working hypothesis. What does that mean? I think it's important to understand this term. I look at it, the simplest way I could explain it, being a non-scientist who could give you a much better explanation. But a working hypothesis is you operate as if something was true. You don't necessarily have to have certain proof that it's true, but you do need to continue to operate and to function on certain assumptions. And it doesn't mean that you just pick random assumptions out of the air, but it does mean that it is how you live your life. I drive over a bridge. I have a working hypothesis that the bridge engineers look things over well. You know, I could demand proof. If I had the knowledge, I could get the proof of it. But for a lot of things in science, even in life, you don't have absolute proof, or you don't have the time or the means to go and find all the details to prove or disprove something, but you still have to act. So a classic one in science that I think of and how we operate is the law of conservation of matter and conservation of energy. And if you're familiar with this, theory, and it's a pretty well-established one, the gist of it is matter is neither created or destroyed in our world, in our universe. So there isn't more matter produced, there isn't matter taken away. And matter and energy, of course, matter is a state of energy, but the hypothesis continues to hold, this law of conservation of matter and energy, that it's neither created nor destroyed. And so because you believe that or operate under that assumption, that means that when something comes up that looks like matter would be created or destroyed, you have to assume that there's a different answer. And one of the big problems, I wouldn't say problems, but one of the big questions in physics is the expansion of the universe. Our universe is getting bigger. We know this. We've measured it. That's a fairly certain thing. But how is it getting bigger? If you think of it like a balloon gets bigger because more gas, more molecules are stuffed into it, and that pushes it out. But if there is neither matter created nor destroyed, there can't be more matter being pumped into the universe to make it bigger. So either somehow matter can stretch, or there's more matter in the universe than we know, which is where you start getting dark matter and dark energy to explain how the universe can continue to expand at the rate that it is expanding when it looks like there isn't enough matter to answer that question. Or, for example, black holes. Black holes are fascinating because, of course, you can't observe a black hole, right? I mean, you can see the stuff around it. When you take a picture of a black hole, you're just taking a picture of an empty spot, and then you can see all the stars and galaxies getting sucked into it. But you can't actually go into a black hole. You can't take a picture of what's inside a black hole, but we know stuff goes into it. Well, what's been interesting is some stuff comes out, some energy will be shot out. It's a quasar, and they make beautiful pictures. You have the disk, and then you have this shooting light coming out. But what they found when they measure it is there's less stuff, less, they call it information, whether it's matter or energy. There's less stuff coming out than goes in. Where does it go? What happens to it? If your working hypothesis is that matter is neither created or destroyed, then you have to come up with something. Is it transmuted? Is it changed? Does it pop out on the other side? I don't know. I can't answer those questions. But the idea of a working hypothesis is not that it's just an assumption you pull out of the air, but it forces you to explore answers along certain lines. Why does Dietrich Bonhoeffer talk about God can no longer be our working hypothesis? Well, he's essentially saying the working hypothesis hasn't been the working hypothesis since secularism started coming about. That this is one of the key points of what makes a secular world secular, is that people don't operate as if God existed. People operate as if God did not. If you went back to the Middle Ages, the old question of if we went back 500 years, would you find a lot of atheists? No, you would find almost zero atheists. People who really, truly, absolutely believed that there were no divinities or spirits in any way, shape, or form were really rare 500 years ago. Now, it's a lot more common, obviously, right? Well, what's changed? What's changed? What's changed is the working hypothesis. In the ancient times, the assumption was not only that God existed, but probably that there were spirits and demons, and some were good and some were bad, and they also operated in our world, and they caused things. If you were sick, it might have been a spirit or a demon, it might have been God punishing you, but when something would come up, your working hypothesis, your assumption that you would operate under is that somehow this is a divine thing. Somehow God or the gods caused it. And so you would operate that way. Neil deGrasse Tyson had this great example that he talked about of this river in, it's now Turkey. It used to belong to Greece. It's on the western coast of Turkey. I wish I could remember which one. But one of the things that started Greek philosophy was when this particular philosopher and the people around him, they were in this village, and they were watching how the river changed directions. And there's a couple ways you could have answered that. One way is it changed directions because the gods changed it. The gods did it. The gods decided for whatever reason they wanted this river to move. Or you could say, maybe there's an explanation that doesn't involve the gods. When this philosopher began to entertain that assumption, began to exclude the Greek gods as his working hypothesis, that narrowed his inquiry to natural explanations, and that's when they started discovering that it was silt. It was silt, rivers cut on one side and they deposit on the other, and they move around all the time, and that this was a natural process, and that the river carried silt, and that was the beginning, he said, one of the big beginnings in the West of scientific thought, was when they looked at things and excluded God as the working hypothesis. And so this is what Bonhoeffer's talking about, that we need to begin, that our world, our secular world, has already excluded God as a working hypothesis. So what's another example he talks about? He says working hypothesis in Ethics and morals. Bonhoeffer talks a lot about ethics and morals. He wrote his books. He actually wrote a book called Ethics. But let's give you an example of this. If you act as if God were real, you would consider your judgment on God's actions as a factor in the actions that you take. So you might worry, what would God do if you went around building big idols? What would you do in your own personal life if you did something that was forbidden? What would happen to you? What would happen to you if you went around killing people? Would you incur God's judgment? Would it happen in this world? Would it happen in the next? That would alter your calculation of what you do. Bonhoeffer is saying that people no longer, when they make ethical decisions, factor in any assumption of God doing anything. They act as if there was no God. Doesn't mean they don't believe in God at some level, that if you poked them hard enough or asked enough questions, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are atheists, but they act as if God were not there. They act as if there was no punishment, no judgment, no consequences to their actions from a divine perspective. Right? So he says people they've already taken God out as a working hypothesis in their ethics. Pascal, he was the philosopher, he did all sorts of really cool science with barometers and barometric pressure, but he's also as famous for anything for his wager, which went something along the lines of, if I live my life as if God exists, and it turns out I'm wrong, then by the time I, die, if I just die and there is no God, I will have lost some. And this is always the assumption, of course, that Christian life involves giving up something that could be fun and enjoyable for a life thereafter, which isn't something Jesus says, but that's part of how this wager goes, right? So I'll change my behavior, I'll abstain from some stuff, I'll spend some time worshiping. There's a cost there, but if I'm wrong, and it turns out there's no God, that cost isn't that high. I still got to live my life. But he says, on the other hand, if I live my life as if there is no God, and it turns out there is one, well, then I could burn in hell. So, if I'm right, I live my God as if there is one, and there is a God, then there's an eternity. Again, he's still stuck in heaven and hell thinking. That's Pascal's wager, and it's all based on a working hypothesis. It's that same idea. Do you live your life as if God existed? When you make your decisions and your calculations, do you factor that in? I remember sitting one time late at night this in college, and there was an atheist guy on my floor, and it was, very late at night, and, everybody had a couple things to drink as I grabbed my coffee, and we had a discussion. It was kind of interesting what he said, because he said, if you really believe this stuff, and that's important to you, and you live your life that way, and you're happy with your life, and it turns out there's no God, it would not have been a waste, because you lived your life the way you're happy with. And I thought it was kind of an interesting sort of reverse on Pascal's wager. Usually the argument goes, if you live your life as if there's a God and there's not, you've wasted your life. But again, that's only if the definition of an ethical Christian life involves giving up anything that feels good and has fun and gives you pleasure and enjoyment. If that's how you view Christianity, that it's all just deprivation and abstention, then you better decide whether the one life you get, you're going to abstain from everything that's fun so that you can get something later. But this is part of what Bonhoeffer is getting at, is we need to rethink that understanding of what religion is. Is it all just about giving up for an eternity later, or is it about gaining more in this life? Because if through Christ I gain more in this life, if following Christ makes my life more today, then even if there's no God, I've won, right? It's made it better. So even if there is no heaven and there is no hell, and I just go to Sheol and I sleep in the dusty place with King David, I haven't lost anything. That's the working hypothesis, right? Okay, so he says that about morals and ethics, but he also says politics, Working hypothesis of God in politics. I think of this, you think of, you go back to the prophets. We'll use that example. The Old Testament prophets. When I go to teach confirmation and I'm teaching about the prophets, I end up having to drag in a lot of history and a lot of the political history of the time. Because when the prophets are speaking, they aren't just giving prophecies to particular individuals to help them through their life problems. That's actually pretty rare. Most of the time, what their prophecies are about the people of Israel, the whole country, the whole city, the whole nation. And they viewed everything that happened in politics from a theological perspective. So if the country was prospering, it was because God gave the prosperity. If the country was winning in battle, it was because God gave the victory. If the country was losing in battle, it's because the country did something wrong. And usually for the Old Testament prophets, it's idolatry. You were putting idols in the temple to Baal and Asherah and this so-and-so. Or you were practicing social injustice. You were exploiting the poor, mistreating those who are vulnerable. You have an economic system that oppresses people. Social injustice and idolatry. And then the prophets will say, look, if you change your ways, if you turn from your ways, God will send that army away, which is kind of an interesting idea. And what happened in the history of Israel is in Jerusalem, at one point, a giant army did come to attack them, called the Assyrians. And the king, as the story goes, repented, changed his ways, turned to God, and guess what? A plague struck the Assyrian army and they turned around. Now the Assyrians, in their own tablets, say a plague struck the army and we turned around. But their version of it, their spin is Jerusalem was a worthless city, who cared about it anyways. But to those in Jerusalem, it was proof. See? God turned them away because of our faithfulness. Well, eventually it went from God turned them away because of our faithfulness to we are immune from being conquered because we have the temple. God would not allow his temple to be destroyed, and God did promise that the line of King David would rule on Jerusalem forever. So as long as we have God's temple and David's descendants, we're immune. So then the prophet Jeremiah comes in and says, hold up, folks, God's changed his mind. If you practice social injustice and idolatry, God won't even care about the lineage or the temple. But the whole political debate wasn't about whose army's bigger, who has more supplies, whose walls are higher, how big the Babylonian army was or was not, how many victories they'd had, what kind of weapons they used. That would be how we'd approach war today, with a working hypothesis that God was not going to turn them away, but that we would have to either win or not win on our own merits. If you look at politics in the way the prophets and in the way the kings at the time did, you see everything through a theological lens. Well, so it became a battle as the Babylonians are circling the city now. Will they sack it or will they not sack it? And it was one theology against another. History would show they did, in fact, sack it. And so God said, I don't even care if my own temple burns. I care more about social justice. That was where he came from. You also see the working hypothesis in politics. I think about even today. You'll go on TV and there'll be these pastors huddled around a politician, saying, this individual here is God's chosen one. This individual is the one God has picked to be the next, senator, president, whatever. And they'll pray over it. Well, what happens if you really truly believe that God is picking this person to win? Well, the God who picks that person to win should make sure that that person wins, right? If God has the power to pick a person, then God has the power to move enough hearts and minds at the ballot box in that person's favor. So what do you do then if the person that you think God picked to win doesn't? Well, now your only options are, I was wrong, God didn't really pick this person, or we were cheated, right? They stuffed the ballot boxes, they rigged the machines, they had dead people vote, I don't know. But of course, then that raises its own theological question. If God is powerful enough to move hearts and minds to vote for your candidate, why is God not powerful enough to move the hearts and minds of the opponents and keep them from stuffing the ballot boxes? So God is powerful enough to move people to vote, but not powerful enough to move people to not cheat. It does create theological problems. That's if you view this God as the working hypothesis in politics, right? And then of course we have science. The last one. And I talked a little bit about the river. I talked a little bit about how that changes. One of the things that they say today, a criticism I've heard, let me make sure I got my papers right here. One of the criticisms I've heard today, and I've heard people say many times, is that modern Christians, we live our lives in the West as if God doesn't exist. That essentially we are they call us functional atheists. We go on Sunday, we hear a message, assuming you go on Sunday. We go on Sunday, we hear a message, and then the second we leave the doors, our lives look no different in any way than the people around us. Now, what would make it different is a big topic of debate, right? Is it an issue of sexual morals? Is it an issue of how you spend your money? Is it, what kind of political system you support? We can debate that. But the essential argument goes that we live our lives as if God didn't exist. And we go about our day with a working hypothesis of God's non-existence. We believe in God, but God's still not a working hypothesis, even for the people who believe in God. And so this is kind of one of our things. Where do we hear? Oh, yeah. You go to the hospital. I had a guy ask me, and this guy had been around the world. He had actually spent time, I think, in Nepal or Tibet, a year or two in a monastery. And he was a veteran, had seen some very ugly stuff, and came out of ward, spent some time meditation. And he's sitting here at this party, and he just asked me flat out, when you pray, are you praying for God to change things? Or are you just praying for God to conform your will to His? And I had to think about that. Because on the one hand, if I really believe that God acts in the world and intervenes in the world, when I sit down and pray for healing, I would actually be praying that tumor shrinks, that the infection goes away, that the broken bone, heals, welds back together, or whatever the scientific phrase is for that. If I'm kind of not sure God actually is involved, if that's my working hypothesis, I would just pray that God would conform me to His will and help me to accept whatever He chooses. But none of that involves anything in the world actually changing. And so the question is, when we pray for healing, do we actually pray that it will be healed? Or, how does God as a working hypothesis fit into that? Okay, and then he goes on even more. I want to hit all these points because they matter. Okay, then in philosophy of religion, God's not even a working hypothesis in philosophy and religion. And then he mentions this guy named Feuerbach. I'm not quite sure where he talks about Feuerbach. Feuerbach was an atheist communist. And Feuerbach kind of believed, like Freud, that God is really just a creation of our wishes and dreams. Freud believed that God was just an imaginary being that we project our fatherhood desires onto. But they were both atheists. There was no working hypothesis of God or not God. They were just pure, straight out, there is no God, period, end of story. I'm not quite sure where he mentions Feuerbach. But, when you talk about God as a working hypothesis in religion, I think that is a good question. When we, go about our lives, do we live our lives as if God, as religious people, if God exists? Now, philosophy, I don't think most philosophers today have God as a working hypothesis. I would tend to assume it would probably be very much the opposite. There's a few handfuls out there, but for the most part, you're not going to, if you ran into Derrida or Foucault, I think they've both passed, they don't really believe in a God. They aren't necessarily Charles. I don't think either of them are quite as hardened as, say, Richard Dawkins to say with certainty that there was no God. Both of them were kind of quite uncertain about the reality of anything and the hard truth of anything. But philosophy hasn't had that for a while. And the truth is, if you do have God as a working hypothesis in your philosophy, they'll usually laugh you out of the room. René Descartes continues to get pilloried endlessly for his meditations, where he doubts everything in the world and ends up, after doubting the existence of matter and even what he perceives, and he's down to supposedly, can I even believe my own thoughts? And then he says, well, if I'm even able to ask the question about whether there is reality, then there must be reality. And if I can even think of the possibility of there being a God, there must be a God who put that thought in me, therefore God exists. And insert atheists going nuts and trying to argue against that. I don't really believe in God because I followed Descartes' reasoning. My only point is that he uses God as a working hypothesis, and they go after him. And so in that sense, Bonhoeffer's right. God is not a working hypothesis in philosophy anymore. And so they go about their inquiries, writing their books, writing their papers, and on the assumption that there is no God, as if God was not be there. Okay, so then he goes on to finish up this particular paragraph. So he says, for the sake of intellectual honesty, the hypothesis should be dropped. So let's quit pretending. Let's quit saying that we operate or live our lives as if there's a God when we all know we aren't. Let's just be honest with ourselves. And he says, and then he has that interesting line at the end. I didn't quite get it. A scientist or physician who sets out to edify is a hybrid. There's lots of scientists and physicians who have a foot in each canoe. I know a Lutheran pastor has a PhD in physics. He'll talk about theology and particle physics in the same breath with an astute knowledge of both. Learning one does not necessarily disprove the other, right? But in the culture of physicists, that makes him an outlier. So he says you're a hybrid. So does that mean you really don't do all of either? Is he kind of insinuating that you're intellectually dishonest if you continue to claim that you have God as how you live your life if you are a scientist? He doesn't elaborate on that. Like a lot of these things, Bonhoeffer doesn't elaborate on it. So we're kind of left to have to guess what he says. All right. Kind of got through that one. Let's switch to the next one. Get me something to drink here this morning. All right, let's read through this next page. It's a little bigger paragraph. Good stuff. Anxious souls will ask what room there is left for God now. And as they know of no answer to the question, they condemn the whole development that has brought them to such straits. I wrote to you before about the various emergency exits that have been contrived, and we ought to add to them the salto mortale, death leap, back into the Middle Ages. But the principle of the Middle Ages is heteronomy in the form of clericalism. A return to that can be a counsel of despair, and it would be at the cost of intellectual honesty. It's a dream that reminds one of the song, Wusst ich doch den Weg zurück, den weiten Weg ins Kinderland. I'll get to that part. There is no such way, at any rate, not if it means deliberately abandoning our mental integrity. The only way is that of Matthew 18:3, i.e., through repentance, through ultimate honesty. Okay, lots of cool stuff to unpack, including a German song. All right, so there we go. Anxious souls, ask what room there is left for God now. I've asked that question. I used to ask that question all the time when thinking about the cross and atonement. And I would think to myself, if you were God, why would you come to earth and endure everything you endured, suffer the sufferings, die on a cross, if one could be saved without it? would it not be just a colossal waste of time if you could just send another prophet or come to earth, teach your message, and then duck out, float back into heaven without the cross? Why would you bother? But of course, I'm on a working hypothesis, there we go, that the one and only possible reason one would endure that suffering is some sort of eternal life salvation. But the truth is, people die all the time for causes, for good reasons. Prophets die all the time for the work of the Lord. People have died throughout the centuries standing up for their faith with no presumption whatsoever that it was going to lead to anybody getting out of hell. You think of all the martyrs, all the Christians who have refused to back down in the face of a threat, even when there's a gun to their head or a sword to their head and they were told to back down and they didn't back down. It wasn't because they thought they were going to save the world or because, it was because they weren't going to give up. Could there be a reason for God to do that? But that was a different working hypothesis, right? But the reason I bring this up is because if you take out a need to appease God's wrath to rescue people from eternal punishment, it creates an anxiety around my faith, an anxiety around my life. Have I devoted my life to one way when there could be an easier way? But then at that point in my life, I was still very much viewing Christianity as being about abstention. And I still viewed it very much in the negative, right? Being a good Christian means giving up lots of things and going without. And because I viewed that, there's an anxiety. And what if I'm giving this up and there isn't really a need, there isn't really, the payoff? Or if I could get this payoff, like that secular guy down the hall, if I get the same payoff, am I wasting things? It's a good question. And so there's an anxiety. There's an anxiety if that working hypothesis has changed. And Bonhoeffer's saying that even at an intellectual level, people are asking, okay, if God isn't involved in our world, if God doesn't change anything or move anything in our world, if God doesn't need to rescue us from an eternal punishment, if God doesn't answer any scientific questions, if the tumor isn't shrunk because of God and the earthquake isn't caused because of God, and the rain doesn't come because of God, if God keeps getting pushed out of everything and everything has an answer that doesn't have to do with God, then what need is there left for God? And Bonhoeffer's right to diagnose that as anxiety. That is anxiety. Staring into that big emptiness, or saying, has it all been irrelevant? Is it all for nothing? What's left? What's left for God? If you can answer everything without, and there are definitely, secularists and atheists who will say, yeah, God's been pushed out of everything, so there's no need. Or kind of agnostics who will say, if there is a God and I die, I'll go, oops, I'm sorry, you got me, and then move on up to heaven anyways, because a God who's really a God wouldn't send people to hell anyways. I've heard that one. Or it was the line, and there's a TV show, gosh, I wish I could remember the name of this guy. It's Amy Poehler's brother, and he marries this Swede, and he goes to Sweden, and I used to watch it because I could totally relate and understand it. And his conservative Texas Christian parents meet her liberal, modern, Swedish baby boomer parents, and his parents are, well, we need to have religion for good morals, and she looks over at him and goes, if we die and it turns out there is a God, you can say, I told you so. I mean, she's basically saying, you can live with the working hypothesis, I won't. If I'm wrong, I'll say you won. But clearly no fear of an eternal punishment, right? So there's an anxiety. There is an anxiety. And then he goes, let's see. Okay, they have no answer. As they know of no answer, they condemn the whole development. So since they can't answer where God would be in this modern world, they condemn science, they condemn secularism, they condemn the whole belief system. And if they can't disprove it, which is kind of where modern fundamentalism is, they can't really disprove the scientific claims, because to do that you have to have more scientific claims. If you want to disprove the Big Bang, you have to come up with theory and evidence. You better start getting your calculator out. You better, start reviewing the star charts and come up with your own theory. If you're going to disprove it, you need your counter-scientific evidence to disprove it. But instead, since that's become harder and harder for fundamentalists to do, the answer becomes to question science itself. And as I've talked about before, this is the reasonable doubt approach of fundamentalism. We can't prove to you that the earth is only 6,000 years old. You have your evidence in geology, your literal mountains and mountains of evidence. I don't have the evidence to disprove it, but I'll just dig through the research and I'll find a geologist who disagrees with that one and I'll go, oh, see, you don't all agree. Oh, how can I trust you? How can I trust you? You know, the way a defense lawyer sits on the stand and says, oh, you said you were there at 9 o'clock and then you said you were there at 8 o'clock. You lied. How can we believe anything you say? Right? This is the stuff you got with vaccines. Oh, well, first you told us we could, then you said we couldn't, then you said it was safe, but I read this thing, this person got sick. Is it safe? Is it not safe? I can't trust you. And the scientist is sitting there being his head going, I never told you it was 100% perfect. I never said there were 0 side effects. I never said that every scientist everywhere has every fact together. And besides, you're not understanding science if you think that there's must be absolute perfect agreement, or therefore it's false. You're not getting it, But the point wasn't ever to convince you to go and do your own epidemiological study and get your microbiology lab and, get your little DNA and RNA and your things in there and run your own vaccine tests to prove it. Who's got that? I mean, we don't have labs around, and very few of us have that knowledge. So what do? We just read that there was a contradiction and go, oh, I don't know if I can believe that. Since I can't trust you, better not take that vaccine. And then you end up as one of the 500 people a day who are still dying of COVID. And I think like 499 of them are unvaccinated by choice. People are still dying every day in this country from a disease that 99.9% of them could avoid dying from simply by taking something. There's mountains of evidence, but you still are clinging to your mistrust. Because it's easier to cling to your mistrust than it is to admit that that expert might be right. But anyways, getting back to what Bonhoeffer is saying, that's the strategy that fundamentalists and reactionary religious people have gotten to with science and secularism, is to just try to convince everybody that as a whole, they cannot be trusted, and their whole process is corrupt, and academia itself is corrupt and untrustworthy. And that's a reactionary answer, right? That's a reactionary answer. And Bonhoeffer is saying that's not going to work in the long run. In the long run, that's not an answer. You can convince your kids up until a certain age that they can't trust scientists about the Big Bang, but they will eventually grow up and they will move out, and most of them will realize the earth was not created in 6 literal days. And you won't be able to continue to put that genie back in the bottle. All right, so then what's the other possibility they do? They might go back to the salto mortale, the death leap, back to the Middle Ages. Can we bring back the Middle Ages? When everything everywhere was a religious theological question, the world was populated by evil spirits and demons and devils that filled the land everywhere, and where the church was absolutely necessary to give you those sacraments and that forgiveness to protect you from those evil spirits and demons that were everywhere, and where people respected the authority of the church because they needed that authority to show them how to avoid those devils and demons and evil spirits that are filling the land, and he's like, come on. He calls it the death leap. The death leap. You're going back to a world where death was or maybe what he's implying with a death leap is that that's going to be the end of Christianity if you try to bring that back. But then he says the principle of the Middle Ages is heteronomy in the form of clericalism. So what he's essentially saying is that was how the medieval world worked. Because everything was filled with hordes and devils and demons, and everybody lived on a razor's edge of going to hell, the clerics, the church, was absolutely necessary for your very existence and survival. And so they had a necessary position in society. Now, I can tell you, as clergy myself, there is no more necessary position in society for clergy. In a best case, they're indifferent. In a worst case, they run from you. I'll give you an example. This was hilarious. I was at a cemetery here in town, and I had just done a funeral at the funeral home, and I'm in my 4Runner driving through this fairly large cemetery, and there's two young guys who, judging by their dress, they did not look like they necessarily slept inside solid buildings. And they see me coming, and they look out, and I got my collar on because I did a funeral, and the guy goes, "There's a priest! Watch out! There's a priest!" And they go bolting through the graves, jumping over the fences. I'm just sitting there laughing like, what did you think I was going to do? Like, jump out and zap you or something like that? You know, I was going to get out of my car. But there's a real fear for some, or a repulsion, right? You're probably a creeper, a molester, you religious people, you know. And there are clergy, I will not lie, who really wish they could bring back the good old days of that, who really wish they could bring the good old days when people saw that collar and were deferential and respectful, and who didn't always assume the worst, or at least just bring up the worst to try to belittle you and mock you, you know. Yeah. There's a desire to go back to that. But the reality is we ain't ever going back. Your credibility as a pastor is suspect. You have to earn it back with people. It's not a fun position to be in, but it is kind of where the church started out. You know, the early Christians did not start out from a position of prestige in society. They didn't start out getting free golf at the local golf course because, you know, the golf course owner was just so respectful of clergy. That's gone. Okay, and then he goes, it's a dream that reminds us of the song, and then he gives us this song. Let me show you the song. Here we go. I looked it up. I Googled it. I'm not up on my German operas. So this is the song is called, translated in German into English is, "Ah, if I but knew the way back," from 1873. In 1873, they were longing for the good old days. Is there ever a generation that doesn't look back to the good old days? So it goes. Ah, if I but knew the way back. I'm not going to try to sing it. I don't even know the tune anyways. The sweet way back to childhood's land. Ah, why did I seek my fortune and let go my mother's hand? Ah, how I long for utter rest, immune from any striving, long to close my weary eyes, gently shrouded by love, and search for nothing, watch for nothing, dream only light and gentle dreams, not to see the times change, to be a child the second time. Ah, show me that way back, the sweet way back to childhood's land. I seek happiness in vain, ringed round by barren shores. Oh, if this is not the good old days, this is almost like a blueberry ice cream commercial, you know, where all they try to do is inspire you with nostalgia of the mythical good old days, you know. And remember earlier, if you watched all these, there's in one of his letters much earlier, Bonhoeffer talks about mature and immature faith. And in an immature faith, it's a lot more like this, right? Everything just is what it is, and isn't it great? You know, a mature faith has to accept struggles and responsibility and and accept criticism and challenges. And Bonhoeffer says churches have a desire, a sort of an innate desire to want to keep people in an immature faith so they don't have to deal with all this hard stuff. And he says it's just like this song, wanting to go back to the good old days when everybody believed and everybody went to church, and scientists, even the scientists were Christians, and a lot of the very early scientists were. The split came later, but that's for another podcast. But yeah, he's saying this is just wishful dreaming. It's just wishful dreaming. Wanting to go back is wishful dreaming. But we do that. And why do we want to go back? Because the future looks hard. And if you can't see the future and the problem feels insurmountable, it's easy to look back on the glorious good old days and to feel nostalgia and wish you could just go back, right? Could we just go back to the 50s? In America, it's always churches want to go back to the 50s when, you wanted to plant a church. So you bought a piece of land, put up a sign and said, church, and people came. There was none of this, well, I'll come once a quarter when my son doesn't have his club sport. That didn't exist, right? People went to church. Nobody made fun. Nobody ran from priests when they saw them in the cemetery. Could we just turn back the clock? Well, in many ways, I think, it's a little bit of a lack of imagination and a lack of faith. Do you really think that God is so small? I mean, think about this. Is your sense of God so small and so weak that you're worried that a few smarmy scientists and podcasters are going to destroy God? Yes, it creates a challenge convincing your kid about God when he's busy listening to Sam Harris podcasts. I won't say that it isn't harder. But, don't you think that God has the power to show you a new way through this secularism? Or are you just going to look at it and throw your hands up and feel like, oh, there's nothing we can do. Let's go back to creating a theocracy. I mean, you see that the world over. It's not just in Christianity. There's other countries with other religions where they have said very loud and clear, we want none of this modern secularism stuff, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to keep it out. We're going to put religion into the government. We're going to get religion in the public schools. We're going to get religion in the public square. We're going to make, religious holidays or state holidays. We're going to use the force of the government to get that religion into every possible nook and cranny of your life to bring back the sense of that religion is the normal way and secularism is that weird Western way that those people do. And they're going to do that. The flip side of that, though, is you have to not, with one hand, push the religion into every nook and cranny, but you got to push out any competing ideas. And you got to push out competing religions. So when someone comes in from another religion and says, well, hey, have you thought about this one? You got to take them out. That's apostasy and proselytizing. We can't have that, we can't have that kind of stuff. So theocracy is an attempt at turning back the clock to keep out the secularism, to go back to the good old days when I, as a minister, didn't have to get laughed at in the Circle K, and I don't want to deal with this secularism. And admittedly, from an institutional perspective, there isn't much of an upside to secularism. It's pretty much just a downside. It's just a struggle. And it's hard, But do you turn to God through this, or do you want to give up? Where does your faith stand on this? So we are not going to go back. I don't want to go back to the Middle Ages. I hope you agree with me on that one. Here we go. I think we just got 2 more slides here. This is the next one. We'll read it through. And we cannot be honest unless we recognize that we have to live in the world etsi Deus non daretur, which means the thing speaks for itself. And this is just what we do recognize before God. God himself compels us to recognize it. So our coming of age leads us to a true recognition of our situation before God. God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. Mark 15:34. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God we live without God. God lets himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. He is weak and powerless in the world, and that is precisely the way, the only way in which he is with us and helps us. Matthew 18 makes it quite clear that Christ helps us, not by virtue of his omnipotence, but by virtue of his weakness and suffering. I could do a whole podcast just on this page. So thank you all for sitting through 10 episodes, because now we're getting to some conclusion. Now we're getting to Bonhoeffer answering the "so now what?" And it's a big chunk, so give me a little bit to walk through this. This is not going to be my shortest episode. All right, we have to live in the world. Let's go back to the beginning to a little bit of the Latin. Etsi Deus non daretur. The thing speaks for itself. So we have to live in a world looking at things as if the things are just the things, if that makes sense. That's kind of a materialist way of looking at the world. So when we see an earthquake, it's just an earthquake. When the earthquake hit Turkey, it wasn't God's judgment on Turkey. It's just an earthquake. When we see California flooded in waters, it's just an atmospheric river, probably caused by us burning too much coal and creating global warming. When New Orleans gets hit by a hurricane, it is not because of debauchery in the French Quarter, as Pat Robertson said. It's just a hurricane, probably exacerbated by global warming by burning too many fossil fuels. But if you look at everything that you see as a divine act, as a miracle, as a divine intervention, right? That's what we said at the beginning. It's what Bonhoeffer said at the beginning. You know, that was how it used to be, but now people don't look at it that way. And Bonhoeffer is saying we as Christians need to look at it that way. We need to see that river shifting course as just a river shifting course, not as a sign from God that, I don't know, something. Which means he's saying we have to push ourselves to start thinking more like secularists. And this is what we do recognize. So the next thing he goes on. We do have to recognize before that God compels us to do this. That God compels us to do this. Right? It's always interesting. When we talk about how God works in the world, talk about the ways that God works in the world, and God operates in the world, and the way God has agency, it does become a bit of a struggle, because there's a couple ways that it tends to devolve into. One way gets kind of superstitious. Like I say, spring break partiers causing a hurricane or something like that. Or I went to a parking lot and I prayed, God, open up a parking space for me, and a space opened up. When you start looking at things theologically, you can get superstitious with them. Or the other way, when you want to look at everything theologically, is that everything can become about tragedy. Right? This is where, again, Bonhoeffer was talking about things in the negative. Right? If God isn't acting in the world, but God intervenes in the spaces where the world isn't answering, where the world isn't functioning, God's kind of in the negative space, then our understanding of God becomes all about the negative. It becomes the endless testimonials about tragedy, right? I overcame God through tragedy, and you hear the testimonials. People will get up and they will tell sometimes very powerful stories. And I don't, for a millisecond, discount them. So let me give that caveat up front. I love hearing how God has worked to help people get through tragedy. And sometimes they're amazing stories, unbelievable stories, and the people will say, I was down, I prayed, things turned around, I turned myself around, and then you say, praise God. What do you do then with the person who isn't going through a lot of tragedy? Where does God fit into that? I remember being in a college group for a brief period of time, and we'd meet on Tuesday nights, and they would tell these testimonials. It was before I quite figured out what that non-denominational was code for fundamentalist. But, I was younger, and they'd tell these stories, and they were always powerful stories. And then they're like, Lars, when are you going to get up and tell your faith story? And I'm like, well, let's see how my faith story is. I grew up, good parents, went to church a lot. God's always been in my life. I love God. I'm like, again, that's no story. That's no story. But the problem was my experience with God was a consistently, mostly positive one. God was an add-on in my life. God wasn't the fill-in for the tragedy. And, I wish that more of the testimonials would have been about how God enriched my life rather than just about God filling in the negative or God rescuing me from the crisis. I do believe God rescues in crisis, but it's like Bonhoeffer was saying, if people's lives are doing okay or mostly good or they think they're good enough, it's not our job as a church to induce a crisis so that we can have a space for God. It's not our job, essentially, to make people sick so that we can cure them. That's deeply unethical. But God would have us know. All right, there we go. God would have us know that, let me go, yeah, God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without Him. So now he's taking it one step further. It isn't just that the world is making us do this, but it's God who's putting us in this position, and God is saying to us, I need you to live in this world without me, without the assumption that I'm acting or doing things. And that's kind of a tough one. God is telling us to live without Him. You got to kind of process that for a second. Bonhoeffer doesn't even try to think of a way that we could depend on Him. Bonhoeffer isn't even leaving a little bit of space for God. Bonhoeffer's saying that God is saying, I'm telling you, there is no space where I'm going to fill in. There is no crutch. That's always a criticism, right? Religious people are weak-minded and use religion as a crutch. There's no crutch. There's no crutch. God is pushing you to do that. And it's a really radical idea. I had to sit with it for a little bit. You might need to, when you shut off the video, sit and think with that. What would that mean? God wants us to live without God. Is this selling out? That was kind of my first impression, was, how you try to fight change and fight change and fight change, and eventually the social pressure surmounts you and then you cave. That's the criticism that conservative Christians always have of those of us in the main line, Social pressure pushes you to do gay marriages, and you just give in to the social pressure instead of standing firm. And I'm like, yeah, because Jesus had that commandment about don't do same-sex weddings. Yeah, no, Jesus didn't say anything about that. But that's the argument, right? You're just giving into social change. My argument, and I'd agree with Bonhoeffer on this one, is that no, you guys are sticking to things that weren't even in the gospel in the first place. You're sticking to things that were added on to the gospel, and now the world has moved past them, and the world has exposed them for what they are, and God wants you to quit clinging to them, but you're clinging to them as if they were essential to the gospel. You're the one who's doing the idolatry here. You're the one who's made an idol out of a particular set of sexual morals that came about largely during the late Victorian era. Think about that. Again, maybe for another podcast. I did do some sessions on that a while back. So, okay, but what does this mean? I don't think this is giving up. I don't think this is giving up or getting in. I think Bonhoeffer would tell you this is getting back to where it was. So, this is where he brings up the scripture. Mark 15:34. This is a big one I'm going to read again. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. Matthew 15:34. What does that say? That's Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Bonhoeffer is not throwing away the cross. That's always a conservative critique of liberals, that we don't want the cross, that we're against the cross. No. In general, it's not, we put the cross front and center. You know, you can see it behind me right here. We put the cross front and center. It's that when we look at the cross, we don't see an angry father beating the crap out of his kid because he can't let go of his anger. We don't see somebody saying, "Daddy, kill me so you don't have to send those people to hell because they inherited a sin gene." We look at the cross and we see a God who is so loving that he gives himself up. But Jesus himself, I mean, you think about that. If there ever was a crisis or a tragedy or a place for God to intervene supernaturally, would it not have been to have pulled his own son off the cross? Or better yet, to just, bonk Judas on the head so he couldn't tell the priests where Jesus was hiding. If God was filling the negatives, the negative space, rescuing from tragedy, pulling us up, if that was God's primary MO, would there not have been a better case in all of the world of a time when the God who rescues and protects should have rescued and protected? And yet, he didn't. Did he? And forsaking, and I think that's very important to look at that word. Forsaking is not punishing. Read that carefully. Jesus doesn't hang on the cross and say, my God, why are you punishing me for the original sin that the people inherited from Adam when they ate the apple? It's not, my God, why are you punishing me? It's not, my God, why are you sacrificing me? It's, why are you forsaking me? You're abandoning me. God abandons those he loves. All these things, think about them for a minute. What kind of testimonial would that be? I was down. I was struggling. God told me he wasn't going to do anything. It's all up to you. You're on your own, kid. I was worried. I was worried about life after death, and God told me he wants me to accept that I'm just going to be on my own to handle things. I was walking by the beach and I saw one set of footprints and I said, God, why is there only one set of footprints? And God said, yeah, I've forsaken you. You're on your own. Walk down the beach yourself, buddy. That's not going to inspire anyone. The God whom we stand before, it says, the God whom we stand before, let me find this up here. Whom we stand, okay, there it goes. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis. God lets us live without the hypothesis. So this is essentially free will. Right? God's not going to force himself on us. God's not going to grab Richard Dawkins by the hair and show him a great sign and make him believe. God lets us be hardened atheists if we want to. He lets us live without the working hypothesis. That's the God before whom we stand. So when you sit there and you pray, you're standing before a God who lets you walk away. That's real freedom. We are not slaves to God. There is no coercion. All right. Is the God before God and with God, we live without God. And it's another one you got to think about. You can kind of do a paper on each of these. Before God and with God, we live without God. We stand before God. We behold God. We are in God's presence, and yet we're without. We're with God, and yet we live without him. What does that mean? Is this deism? I think about that, like Thomas Jefferson. in the Enlightenment. Miracles don't happen. They're supernatural. Jesus didn't walk on water. It's a metaphor or a mistake. And that was what Thomas Jefferson did, and he went through his Bible and he cut out miracles and said, the Bible's good for morals and ethics. So you can go online, you can buy a Jefferson Bible, where he literally cut and pasted all the things out he didn't like. Is this deism? Is Bonhoeffer saying God wound up the clock and walked away? God set the universe in motion and stepped back? I don't think so. I don't think Bonhoeffer's claim is that God has left the building. But he's saying that God is not forcefully intervening in the building. There's a difference. If God didn't intervene at all, he wouldn't have come to earth as Jesus anyways. That would have been too much intervention. He wouldn't even come to do moral teaching like Thomas Jefferson said. He would have not come at all, because coming at all is intervening. But he didn't come in power to force us to do anything. He didn't choose to take over and make himself king and say, like Fidel Castro, you people need me to teach you what the right way is. I will come and fix you for you, but I know that if I gave you freedom of speech, you wouldn't be able to handle it. So for your own sake, let me decide for you what you can and can't think. I'll keep out those bad Yankees trying to teach you those ideas, right? God doesn't work that way. God doesn't work that way. He doesn't take away our freedom for our own good. So if God is not acting in the world to an ordinary person, since you're feeling like there's not much health in this life, and there's no punishment, so if God's not intervening and doing these sort of miracles you don't believe, or if you don't believe that there's no hell afterwards, which again, Bonhoeffer says there's no metaphysical hell. So wouldn't we say, why bother? God just leaves us and stares at us and kind of says, you're on your own, buddy. And I'm supposed to be drawn to stand before the God who leaves me alone? Here's where what Bonhoeffer says is very similar to what a lot of atheists say. If you think about this. Jean-Paul Sartre, I'll bring up him again. Sartre always used to complain when he'd sit there, with his stereotypical cigar on the Rue de something to something in Paris. And he'd say, one of the comments he made is that he says that a lot of atheists, he says these days would have been what, 50s, 60s, they live as if they're Christian. They have the moral, ethical compass that's been taught to them by centuries of Christianity. They live as if they were Christians, but they just don't go to church and they profess no belief in God. But in their practical lives, they're basically still Christians. He says a true atheist needs to stare into the abyss to understand the overwhelming responsibility of a life that has nothing past it. To him, being an atheist meant you had to really just look and recognize this really is all there is. And if you really think about this being all there is, that overwhelms you with responsibility. That there's no easy way out for an atheist. And so that was one of his critics. The other atheists aren't really embracing the nothingness, the void. Bonhoeffer comes along and says, Christians are operating as if there was no God. He's giving the opposite claim. They go to church and claim they're Christian, and then they walk out and they act as if God didn't exist. They are operating like the atheists do, except they have not stared into the cross and looked at the true emptiness and looked at being forsaken and looked at a God of total weakness. And they've not looked at that and wanted to embrace the awesome responsibility of a life with a God who shows us weakness and a life with no power. So Bonhoeffer is saying, don't stare into the abyss, stare into the cross. And essentially, by making the cross all about substituting a substitution for punishment, it takes away that sense of being forsaken and makes it all part of a carefully orchestrated plan. But Bonhoeffer is saying we need to be willing to stare into that abyss. The cross is the abyss, it's the nothingness. It's before what we stand, and it gives us no out, no escape, no convenient answer, just the awesome weakness. And that's where we get down here. God lets himself be pushed out of the world and onto the cross. God isn't letting himself be punished to satisfy himself. God is letting himself be pushed out of the world. Remember how he did that? God's been pushed out of science, morals, ethics, politics. God's letting himself be pushed out. Where does he get pushed out? Into nothingness? No, onto the cross. God lets himself be pushed out of the world and onto the cross. And that is precisely the way, the only way, in which he is with us and helps us. He is only with us by allowing himself to not be with us. And he makes it quite clear that Christ helps us not by virtue of his omnipotence, but by virtue of weakness and suffering. This is a God of total weakness. Total weakness. The only virtue, I don't know the only virtue, but the virtue is weakness and suffering. That's the virtue of the cross. When you look at the cross, you should see weakness and suffering. When Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, what he is saying is take up powerlessness, weakness, and suffering. I wish that this was proclaimed a little bit more. And yes, it gets a little bit philosophically, I think most of us going through our daily lives don't really want to spend a lot of moments staring into the abyss. I do think that sometimes that's where, sometimes we do encounter God the most in huge tragedy, because that is the closest we come to looking into the abyss. When we see a loved one gets killed in a car accident because of a drunk driver. A senseless, pointless death that doesn't achieve anything for the greater of the world. You aren't pulling kids out of a fire. You aren't stopping a broken bridge or anything like that. You're just getting killed because somebody drove the wrong way down the road because he was drunk and irresponsible and selfish. And I think it's in those moments often when you feel the most like God has forsaken you. God has forsaken you. And we do our best not trying to answer the person in suffering by saying, well, yeah, there really is a plan, or God really wanted an angel. We're better off in that moment acknowledging, yeah, it sucks. God's forsaken you. And I think that's part of why we tend to, in those moments, will either forsake God wholesale, or that's when we'll feel closest to God. Partly, we're less arrogant, but partly also, we have felt God forsake us the most. God is with us the most when God has forsaken us. God does not call us into power. God does not call us into taking power. The cross does not say, I died for you, now make sure that people who criticize you go to jail. That's not what the cross says. That is blasphemy. God helps us by his weakness and suffering. Okay, one more. I know I'm going long, but I can't shorten this one. It's good stuff. Here is the decisive difference between Christianity and all religions. Man's religiosity makes him look in his distress to the power of God in the world. God is the Deus ex machina, The Bible directs man to God's powerlessness and suffering. Only the suffering God can help. To that extent, we may say that the development towards the world's coming of age outlined above, which has done away with a false conception of God, opens up a way of seeing the God of the Bible, who wins power and space in the world by his weakness. This will probably be the starting point for our secular interpretation. This is the starting point, kids. You know Bonhoeffer is a deep thinker, and man, I wish the Nazis would have let him go, because the world would have been amazing to have read this book that would have gotten written. But Bonhoeffer, in his own life, remember, he didn't believe in a metaphysical hell, but he actually had the chance. When he was being moved from prison to prison, the car broke down, and he had the chance to run. He could have just bolted off into the woods. And he only had a few weeks before the Allies came through anyways. I'm not as big of a man as him. I would have run like the devil. I would have been out there in the woods. I would have eaten cockroaches till the Allies came. But he looked at the cross of the God who forsaked him, believing that there was no metaphysical hell, and he got back in that bus with the people and went off to the SS camp to die. So I don't want to hear the claim that there's no point in offering a life for Jesus if we don't feel like we're offered this carrot. Our motivation should not be about carrots and sticks. God's motivation is love for its own sake. But anyways, all right, let's go back up to the top. Here is the decisive difference between Christianity and other religions. It's in powerlessness. I would argue that it's the difference between Christianity and lots of other versions of Christianity. You know, there's so little talk of powerlessness in Christianity. In fact, there's not a whole lot of talk about power and power dynamics and good use of power and how power oppresses and systems of power and structures of power and defending power. I think we're starting to get more of that now. Liberation theologians started it. It does tend to be a very liberal critique because liberals tend to view the world through systems and structures, not through as much personal morals. But, you know, the idea of embracing powerlessness, I can just still remember sitting up there in Seattle in 2005, going to this conference and listening to this Mark Driscoll character who was just one of the most hateful, awful buffoons, who was also both a very successful, hateful, awful, bigoted buffoon. But I could see him sitting up there talking hour after hour about how A, feminism was the scourge of the world, but B, how Jesus was a tough, strong, masculine, powerful endurer of suffering. And that when you look at that cross, you don't see weakness and powerlessness. You see a tough guy who's tougher than the toughest tough guy. Because look at how much he endured. Look at all that pain he endured. Look at how much toughness it takes to endure that pain. Oh, he's tough, 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 tough. I mean, it was just, wow. And I remember thinking, you know, yeah, now I know why you're successful. Because who doesn't want to embrace? Who doesn't want to be tough? Who wants to be weak and vulnerable? And I think that's partly why, one of the many reasons why he hated feminism so much, and why he hated mainline churches so much, and why he hated gays so much, was because he saw in them weakness, vulnerability, relationship. You know, he didn't even like any relationship that didn't have an absolute authority power dynamic. And he grew like crazy, and he filled that room. He could pack them in. He could pack 1,400 people in 5 times a Sunday. Man, we were like, wow, that's impressive. Well, yeah, we're drawn to power. We love power. The message of power attracts. The message of powerlessness and weakness, that's for wussies. Who wants that? One of the biggest heresies in Christianity, I think, and I think Bonhoeffer would agree with me, is the love of power. Thinking that we can solve things with power, and thinking that the way of the cross is the way of power instead of the way of weakness and vulnerability. Looking at the cross is always presented a problem because it looks like weakness and vulnerability, and so that's why you have to spin it into a sacrifice or a proof of toughness. So he said, Bonhoeffer says, we'll go on. Man's religiosity makes him look in distress to the power of God. Right? Because we don't want to look to powerlessness. We want power of God. We want that God from the machine, the giant God, to drop in and fix us and restore that sense of power. And in many ways, that's what we're trying to restore. The wholeness, what we're thinking, where we're telling ourselves is wholeness, is often just a restoration of our power. It's the God from the machine, from Greek myth, who drops down at the end of the play to put everything back in order. The Bible directs man to God's powerlessness and suffering. Over and over, God's powerlessness and suffering. Only the suffering God can help. Ooh. Again, that sounds paradoxical, right? If you have power, why aren't you fixing it? That's the atheist critique. You know, if God is all powerful, why did he let the Holocaust happen? Good question. Bonhoeffer's, the answer he leans towards is, you're not talking about a powerful God. You're looking at the question wrong. And so then he says, the world's coming of age, about midway through the paragraph, the world's, to the extent that we may say that the development toward the world's coming of age outlined above, which has done away with a false conception of God. So what Bonhoeffer is saying here is not that, he's not saying that the secularists have taken away something that's true that we need to bring back. He's essentially saying the secularists have gotten beyond the things that we're clinging to, and the things we're clinging to aren't really of God anyways. It's sort of that critique of the secularist understands Jesus better than the Christian does. Although in the Gospels there's lots of situations where the person who isn't very practicing in their religion sees God the best or knows Christ the most. You know, the Roman centurion who goes around openly oppressing people turns around and says, "You are truly the Son of God." Meanwhile, the priests in charge of protecting the religion are, get rid of that guy, he's a threat. Right? It opens up. So the world getting rid of that stuff opens up a way of seeing the God of the Bible, who wins power and space in the world by his weakness. Every time you look at Christianity and the abuses that people point out, the Inquisitions, the Holy Wars, the abuses of children, on and on and on, somewhere at their root is that desire for power, the use of power, the misuse of power. It always boils down to power. Mark Driscoll himself, Mr. Tough Guy Jesus, his whole church collapsed around him because, this will shock you, he was an authoritarian who abused his power. The biggest heresy, the biggest idol is power. But that's a hard pill to stomach. Because the cross, and Jesus says over and over, if you're going to be my disciples, you must take up your cross and follow me. You must be prepared to suffer. You must be prepared to not just die, but to die without any comfort or consolation, without any carrot of reward. You must be prepared to take on the role of weakness. It is when the church takes on a role of weakness that it is at its best. I think of the medieval popes who waged armies and burned heretics, and then you compare them to the current one, Francis, and you can see which one does a lot better at relating to people in the world and which one has brought the church more credibility. The old ones were protecting the church through power and authority. The current one goes to the prison and washes people's feet. You know, the current one, instead of kicking the homeless people off the Vatican gorgeous buildings, he feeds them. Which one do you think is a more testimony to Christ? And why do you think that your secular friends like Pope Francis a lot more than they like, I don't know, Leo X? Although I'll admit, most of the Catholics I would run into think Leo X was a complete slime bag too. Google him, he was a slime bag. All right. That's what I got today. Oh my gosh, almost an hour and a half. Hope you've been able to bear with me. The beauty of the internet is you can stop or pause it. But I wanted to take this home, and I didn't want to get this close and not take it home. Let me see here. There we go. All right. That's me talking for today. If you have more thoughts, things to add to the discussion, please do. We've got the comment sections both on Facebook and YouTube. And you can always, of course, message me. I'm right here in my office up here in Marana. And I'll meet anyone for coffee. I'd love to sit down and chat and talk about this some more. I hope, again, as always, I hope it's been helpful for you. And I hope it's given you some stuff to rethink in your faith and to help grow. Maybe show a different vision of what Christ is from what you've seen. Anyways, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. I still have one or two more. We are not done. I got one or two more. I'll be back next week and maybe the week after that. You guys have a good week.